Okay, good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. I think a number of people are coming through the lobby, and this is a session that's had a fair bit of interest. I think we've had 360 people register, and it is a very, very topical subject for the industry. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands where we meet today, and for me, that's the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and to recognise their elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people that we might have with us today. So today's session is Achieving a Nationally Interoperable Rail Network. Reform is nigh. And today our speaker is Caroline Walsh, the Chair and Commissioner from the National Transport Commission. Just a bit of background first about Caroline. She's had 35 years experience in the Commonwealth and New South Wales public services, focusing on industry, science and transport issues. She's currently chair of the National Transport Commission and a member of the board of the New South Wales Environmental Protection Authority. She provides consultancy services in safety and risk management. Caroline is a former commissioner of the Australian Transport Safety Bureau and has served on the boards of the New South Wales Work Cover Authority, the Sydney Metropolitan Authority, and from 2004 to 2009, Caroline was the Chief Executive of New South Wales Independent Transport Safety and Reliability Regulator. Caroline is a Bachelor of Economics degree, qualifications in risk management and auditing, and is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. As I said, this for the rail industry is an exciting subject. Reform is not just nigh, it's on the way. I don't want to take away any of Caroline's thunder. And I think for all of us today, I would encourage people to have a think about, hey, here's some big ticket things that government and the NTC are driving, and that's to be applauded. And how do we, the rest of industry, with all those other many interoperability harmonisation opportunities, how do we ride off their coattails and use this momentum that being created by government to really, yeah, as I say, create a bit of a bow wave for change in the industry. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Caroline. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Damien, and thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to you again. I know that I've given a couple of presentations on this reform program over the years, and I really appreciate the opportunity to keep people up to date on what's going on, because it is, as you say, Damien, working at a rapid pace now, and we've really all got to just get on board to take this opportunity, grab it with both hands, and I think do some great things for this industry. So really appreciate the opportunity. So I'll get straight into it. A little bit about the NTC. Elizabeth, thank you. Next. A little bit about the NTC. For those of you who aren't familiar with the National Transport Commission, we're a federal agency that's been established under an Act of Parliament, under a Commonwealth Act of Parliament, to support the national land transport reform in Australia. We are accountable to the Infrastructure and Transport Ministers meeting. I always hesitate there because it changes its name very regularly, but it's currently known as ITM, and that is the Commonwealth and State and Territory ministers responsible for infrastructure and transport, and we're accountable jointly to all of those ministers. So we're independent of any single jurisdiction, but we're accountable to all of the governments across Australia. Small agency at the minute, punching well above its weight, particularly in rail, but also in road transport reform, doing work in preparing legislation and a regulatory framework for automated vehicles, doing a lot of good work all across the land transport reform area. What I want to focus on today is the topic of interoperability, and specifically about rail, and let you know where we're up to as far as that reform's concerned. To kick off the discussion, what I'd like to do is share with you a video that the National Transport Commission has just prepared off the back of the Rail Technology Forum that we held in association with ARA's conference for the Ausrail in November last year. And during that technology forum, we had up to 100 senior leaders in rail across the country and internationally from abroad. The forum brought together not only RIMS, ARA, RISSB, above rail operators, but also these representatives from overseas, which included the Rail Safety Standards Board from the UK, the US Office of Federal Railroad Administration, the European Agency for Railways, who joined in at 4 o'clock in the morning, their time from Europe, EU Links and WABTEC. And those international guests were able to really share some significant insights into how these challenges of interoperability are being addressed in other jurisdictions, including in places like the very complex EU arrangement, which isn't just trying to get interoperability within nations, but across nations. So we had really good insights from those people about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities for actually moving forward. We then had a panel discussion. Damien, you were part of that discussion and enjoyed that opportunity to have a dialogue with you and Wayne and others from government and operators to look at a possible framework in which we can actually have a new standards arrangement in Australia that actually locks people into obligations around interoperability. So just to kick off, I'd like to share with you this video. You'll be the first people to have seen it. So over to you. Interoperability basically means that any train, no matter what network it's going over, can operate at the highest level of safety and productive performance that that network offers. There's going to be billions of dollars spent over the next 10, 15 years in upgrading our railway systems to be more digitally based. If all those train control systems can't talk to each other and talk to the train in a seamless way, we won't get the maximum benefit from that investment.
If we have artificial or hard blockers that change that seamless flow, that creates a significant impediment for efficiencies, for safety, and for continuity and cost.
Through interoperability and some standards there, critical ones, you should be able to seamlessly send freight across the country. It makes it easier for drivers, it's easier for skilled workers, it's safer, it's more productive, and it's better for the country.
Well, standards play a really important role in terms of the technology, the frameworks and consistency, the interplay. It helps suppliers understand what they're aiming for, helps companies keep those coordination and the safety base.
For me, buying vehicles and railway equipment for Victoria, the challenge is looking at the componentry I need to buy, how much I need to buy, and often it's a small amount. Working together with other states and having commonality of components, common standards, enables us to set the volume up, reduce the issues and reduce a lot of the cost, as well as manufacture here.
Standards also relate to the rule book. At the moment, because we've got different ways of getting trains across the country, a train driver needs to be skilled up and competent in up to 6 or 7 different operating systems to be able to drive that train. Imagine if you went from New South Wales to Victoria driving your car and a traffic light meant a different thing in Victoria than what it does in New South Wales.
The US has had standards since the early 1900s, primarily standards to ensure mechanical interfaces, to ensure safety as systems got more complex.
Standards really help benefit interoperability in the UK by defining a common baseline. They reduce risk and uncertainty for the actors within the system. They enable suppliers to supply the market and open the market to new suppliers and reduce barriers to entry. These standards that we produce are as a result of collaboration across the whole of the industry and are actually owned by the industry.
Collaboration is absolutely paramount. We need to be able to actually come together at the same table, articulate the goals and the outcomes that we want to achieve, and actually at the same time hold one another to account. Without a doubt, interoperability is a major challenge for us here in Australia, and we've got a lot of work to do in order to achieve that.
It's clear from government this needs resolution and it needs a long-term plan that we can stick to.
Thanks for that. Now for the next slide. Next slide. Get off that one. That's it. Great. Thank you. So that is a great explanation by all of those people who spoke on that video about what the potential benefits are of getting interoperability into our rail system. And of course, people might say, well, we've got standards in Australia too. RISSB does a great job in terms of developing standards. But of course, as we all know, those standards are not mandatory. And so therefore, they don't guarantee an interoperable solution for future train control systems. And so achieving interoperability is no sure thing in Australia and has not been a sure thing. In fact, up until a few years ago, I would say we were definitely heading to the digital break of gauge for the future, with a number of different rail infrastructure managers developing their systems without sufficient interaction with each other to ensure that those systems could actually talk to each other. And I think it was Wayne who mentioned at the Tech Forum that we've been trying to get a single national rule book for over 25 years, and really we're making minimal progress. So that's all been of little avail. So we do know now that rail infrastructure managers across the country are investing in new rail systems, and what we need to do in this agenda is to ensure that they can actually be interoperable so that all trains operating across all of those networks can operate at the highest level of safety and productivity. Now, the reason why I think that we're in a really good space now and why I'm so hopeful that we're going to avoid that digital break of gauge is we now have total commitment within governments for this reform, and we also have a significant awareness amongst key players in the rail industry that we've got to get this sorted. So the challenge of advancing interoperability is now on the agenda of the National Cabinet. I mentioned that in the last webinar that I was presenting to you, but just to remind you that this is not just on the National Cabinet as part of general transport reforms, it is on the National Cabinet as one of 8 priorities for the nation. And if you look at those boxes at the bottom of that slide, that includes things like removing constraints from the construction industry, it includes gender balance in the labour market, improving human services, housing actions. So it's actually quite a significant thing that rail interoperability has got this level of attention amongst premiers, the Prime Minister and Chief Ministers across the country. And the ITEM meeting is required to report regularly to the National Cabinet on progress in this area. Some of the things that have been driving this understanding of the need to do this actually has been driven very much by the supply chain, and I want to recognise that. At the first National Technology Forum that the NTC held in late 2022, 3 of the major national suppliers of rail systems in Australia gave great presentations explaining how our bespoke and different systems across the country is basically driving up cost and complexity within Australia for delivering infrastructure projects. One CEO described, and I think I've mentioned this before, as saying, "You Australians, you're all crazy," because we haven't really grabbed this issue and recognised it as being one that affects not just safety but also productivity and cost, as some of the people in that video explained. When we held a National Skills Forum last year, Naomi Knight, the Chief Engineer at Siemens, mentioned about how the lack of consistent competency management frameworks within Australia amongst each of the rail operators was actually causing increased costs for suppliers and having to have multiple competency management systems to meet each of their bespoke needs. And we're saying that also meant that her engineers potentially couldn't move from project to project across different RIMs because their competency wasn't necessarily recognised by another operator. So these are the sort of things that we're trying to achieve through this national reform agenda. Now, a really important thing, so go next, a really important reform coming out of this, and it's not a reform so much as an enabler, is that last year we developed a national memorandum of cooperation that actually brings together all of the Australian governments and all the Prime Minister, the Commonwealth Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, and all the state and territory ministers have all signed up to this memorandum of cooperation, along with the ARA, lead railways in Australia, and members of the supply chain. And this memorandum is ensuring that they have committed to moving towards an interoperable rail system. So we're locking in commitment at the very senior levels of both government and industry. Next. So just a bit of a recap on the National Rail Action Plan. I think many of you will be aware that the plan actually commenced in 2019 after a very successful engagement coordinated by the ARA to present to ministers about some of the challenges that still confronted the railway industry in Australia. Over the last 4 years, there's been a focus on 3 core themes: interoperability, harmonisation and skills. Some of the NRAP achievements to date have included the development and delivery of the National Rail Skills Hub, and lots of work happening between the ARA, industry and the NTC in the skills space. We've developed in concert with RISSB a 3-year harmonisation plan to fast track some key standards that need to be developed to make sure that we can get some scale in the manufacturing space in Australia, and through RISSB, the development of a national rolling stock register, which is really a precursor for some reforms in relation to type approvals across the country, and I'll come back to that a little. We've also developed and had ministerial endorsement for a national interoperability framework, which includes the delivery of a national network for interoperability, and I'll show you that map in a second, that defines what we mean by the national network. And as I just mentioned, we've also secured that memorandum of cooperation amongst all of the key players. Last year, the ministers then agreed to a further 4-year work program that gets down to a lot of very detailed and specific work in terms of what needs to be done to achieve an interoperable network. That current 4-year program was approved by ministers in June last year and is driven by the need for a national approach to rail, greater consistency to align standards, strengthening the depth and size of the workforce, and, as I've mentioned, avoiding the repeat of history of the that led to the different rail gauges. So on that slide, you can see what the new 5 key priorities for ministers are that was agreed at that time, and that includes locking in standards to advance interoperability, and I'll get to that next, ensuring train technologies for now and the future are interoperable, reducing the burden on drivers, crew and maintenance workers. As was mentioned in the video, the different systems actually lead to an extra burden and some human factors issues for those people who are driving and crewing our trains across the country, and this work will help to reduce the burden on them in terms of their tasks. Work to streamline rolling stock approval regimes, which at the moment are very disparate around the country and acting as a great disincentive for investment, particularly in the freight sector in Australia, and delivering workforce solutions to meet future rail skills demand. So I'll come back to those 5 priorities in a moment and tell you how we're actually progressing those. But next. First, I want to, though, let people know about the National Network for Interoperability. The most important thing as far as this reform is concerned is for our policymakers and government leaders to recognise, because it's well known within the rail industry, that we don't have a single national network for rail. I think a lot of people outside of rail believe that the delivery of a standard gauge network across the country, which is largely represented on the map there, is actually a network of networks and operated by different companies or rail infrastructure managers. So in acknowledging that, the difficulty with this is if each of those rail infrastructure managers continue with their legacy systems that were all quite different, and as they're making changes, aren't making changes that are all signed up to a vision for a future set of standards and operating systems, then this is where we'll lead to the break of gauge. So this map is actually very, very important. It is different to the designated interstate rail network, which at one point was designed to be the end-to-end port-to-port, terminal-to-terminal map, but in fact became known as the ARTC network, which, as you can see from the red lines there, is a very large and important network in Australian rail, but does not deliver rail right across from terminal to terminal and port to port across that national system. In fact, we've got other operators, Horizon, Arc Infrastructure, the New South Wales Country Regional Network, which is separate to Sydney Trains, all being involved in actually operating trains across that network. And while it's not visible on the map in the particular lines, they also have interfaces into connections into Brisbane, with V-Line into Melbourne, and the PTA into Western Australia from the ARC infrastructure network. So there's a lot of interfaces. The biggest one and the most complex one is clearly in New South Wales. And so cracking that nut in terms of those interfaces between ARTC and Transport for New South Wales, representing Sydney Trains and the Country Regional Network, is obviously very challenging and very important. So what we want to do is make sure that that network is truly interoperable, and as I say, that every train, by and large, freight and passenger, can speak to that network's system in a seamless way, so not multiple units within a cab that create that burden on drivers, through a single interface, and be guided through that system at the highest level of protection that's offered by that network's technologies. We are going to make sure that that map is developed and used in a very specific way, and I'll come back to how we're planning to do that. So next. Firstly, though, from that map, I want to move on to what I was referring to as the National Rail Standards Framework. As we know, the current co-regulatory approach in Australia means that each rail infrastructure manager or rail transport operator, for that matter, rolling stock operators as well, are free to use whatever standards and technologies they choose in order to, and that creates opportunities in terms of innovation and ensuring that it meets the particular risks and needs of those operators. But there is no requirement for any particular standards to be adopted, and therefore the rail transport operators just have to comply with the requirement to demonstrate to the regulator that their system is safe. It doesn't necessarily, though, require any overt requirement to ensure that it is interoperable and providing an even safer environment for all trains operating across that national network. So at the moment, none of the RISSB standards are mandatory, and therefore there's no way that we can lock in and assure interoperable systems across the country. So in December 2023, the Australian Infrastructure and Transport Ministers approved this 3-tier national standards framework, and this is at its conceptual stage at this point. There's been no standards that have been developed or mandated as yet, but the first 3 areas that the ministers agreed that we do need to develop mandated standards and have them approved through ITM, and through ITM into legislation. At this stage, we're envisaging that this would be under the Rail Safety National Law and enforced by ONSA. And the first 3 areas for mandated standards are digital train technology. This will be performance-based, and so we're not going to be prescribing which digital train technology, but it'll be a performance-based mandated standards about what their interoperable requirements will be. The second is a single onboard interface for drivers and crew. That's that point about making sure that these are seamless and interoperable for the drivers within the cab. And streamlining rolling stock approvals. As I mentioned before, the type approvals at the moment are demonstrably a significant impediment to investment in freight rolling stock in particular across the country. So at the centre of this standards framework will be those mandated standards, those things that you must do. The next layer at Tier 2, an agreement to harmonise standards and rules and ways of working to lift national productivity. So using the RISSB standards and agreed, but with we're looking for greater mechanisms in terms of either compliance requirements or even preferably incentives to actually encourage the take up and adoption of these standards so we do get a harmonised outcome. The third layer of this framework is around local level standards, that you need local procedures and things to deal with, bespoke, what are individual risks that need a bespoke solution within a particular railway. So that's the framework we're moving to. And what we see the benefit of that is, this was mentioned throughout that video, is increasing the manufacturing of local rolling stock componentry through more harmonisation and more scale within the industry to support local manufacture, streamlining the infrastructure supply chain to actually improve efficiency, the sort of things that Naomi and others in the supply chain have been talking about inefficiencies in our current market, ensuring that our infrastructure is being built to deliver safety outcomes, having procedures to improve both efficiency and safety, and having the training and skills accreditation requirements for repeatable tasks that allow for portability of our workforce across different railways. So I also just want to mention in this space that the NTC is working with the ARA, ONREC and RISSB to undertake some research into the benefits of harmonised standards to enable a more efficient rail industry. And that research is hopefully going to provide us with some more insights into the current barriers in adopting harmonised standards so that we can address them as part of the policy reforms. So next slide. So while we've been doing all of that, the team has also been working with EY, and many of you would know Rod Staples at EY, who's been working on a preliminary business case to identify what the pathway forward in terms of costs and benefits would be to address the interoperability of train control and signalling systems. We're looking at this in two streams. The first is along the eastern seaboard. We know that Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, all developing train control systems based around the European train control standard. And notwithstanding the fact that they're adopting the European standard, should they bespoke those standards, even passenger trains operating down that network will not be able to be compatible with each of those systems. So fortunately, through the work we've done already and before mandating any standards, there's been a great deal of cooperation under this arrangement by those eastern seaboard operators to work together to ensure that they're not bespoking those standards as they deliver them, and to ensure we have that seamless interoperability between the networks that are actually adopting the European standard. So that's the first phase of work. The second focus area is on the interface between the ARTC network, which at the moment is looking at their evolved ATMS process and agreeing a pathway for getting an interoperable technology solution between the ARTC's train control system and this European train control system, which, if they're all the same along the eastern seaboard, means that interface will work whether going into Brisbane, Sydney, or into Melbourne. And then I know that South Australia and Western Australia are keeping a very close eye on all of this in terms of what that means for them in the rollout of their future train control systems. So we're very pleased that both the government jurisdictional representatives and who are the funders effectively of each of their railways and the rail infrastructure managers are cooperating greatly in this sort of space, and I think recognising the fact that governments are very committed to finding a solution here and are expecting us to work cooperatively for a solution in these areas. And that's the process we're using in the meantime, so that we don't have to wait for the amount of time it takes to deliver the standards framework and the mandated standards to ensure that the horse hasn't already bolted before we get that longer term framework in place that's really driving us towards an interoperable solution. So coming back to the 5 priorities, so next slide, and how we're actually going to progress each of those. I mentioned each of them earlier. I just focus firstly on priority 4, the streamlining rolling stock approval regimes. Work on that by 9 Squared has already commenced last year, and they're looking at options for streamlining rolling stock approvals, and they're working on the development of a preliminary business case to examine options about how we might do better in this space through mutual recognition, whatever the case might be, about the options for getting more streamlined type approvals. There has already been significant engagement with RIMS and operators in that space, and we're looking forward to the outcomes of that work. The other 4 priorities have been subject to a series of tenders by the NTC late last year, and I'm pleased to announce that just as recently as the last few weeks, NTC has signed up these companies for some further work in this space, and I'll just take you through each of those 4 projects, what they're doing and what they're going to cover. So from the left-hand side, in terms of locking in standards to advance interoperability, that contract's been awarded to Sistra and Palazzi Rail as a consortium, and that work is going to design and develop a public consultation process to ensure all parties provide input on the development of the 3 mandatory standards that I referred to. So they're going to prepare a stakeholder engagement approach and an initial issues paper to go out for consultation to people with. They will then develop detailed position papers for further consultation and inform a pathway forward about timing, effectiveness, efficiency, flexibility, compliance costs, and regulatory impact. So that's the scope of work that Sistra and Palazzi will be doing. The second priority area, ensuring train technologies for now and the future are interoperable, will be led by Deutsche Bahn Engineering and Ernst & Young, EY. That's again Rod and his team. What that bit of work will do is to determine the key principles for aligning the digital train control and signalling system. So this is getting down more into the detail of the technologies involved and supporting an agreed pathway on an interoperable technology solution. And that's both for the Eastern Seaboard and then for that interface into the ARTC's network. So they'll be providing more technical advice on how to assess systems as how do we make sure that those systems are being independently assessed as being interoperable so that investors, governments, and other investments have got the assurance that the proposed technologies that are being implemented are in fact going to deliver and demonstrate an interoperable outcome. So they'll be developing a discussion paper identifying where the benefits and costs accrue for the interoperable systems so that we can then support to the debate about funding and particularly inform the debate about if there are winners and losers between parties in relation to the costs and benefits that accrue from an interoperable solution, how that actually might be addressed. The third area is reducing the burden on drivers, crews and maintenance workers, which I referred to earlier. That work is going to be progressed by Tactics, and they're going to deliver an impact analysis reports and national implementation plans on options to remove the regulatory compliance and training barriers to crew and options for a nationally harmonised training and onboarding process. That will build significantly on the work that's already been underway in this space between, as I say, the ARA and NTC alongside industry players. The fourth new one, which is priority 5, has again been awarded to Deutsche Bahn and Ernst & Young, and that relates specifically to the future rail skills and particularly digital skills that are going to be required across the rail industry. And they're going to look at 4 key areas: the future rail skills framework to refine existing skills gap research and identify accelerated learning pathways for digital rail skills. They're going to map and develop learning pathways, recommendations for priority rail-specific digital skills. They're going to develop options for pilot program initiatives to accelerate learning pathways, demonstrate mutual recognition and skills portability, and demonstrate that from the point of view of compliance requirements back into the regulatory framework as well. They'll also examine the successful local and international diversity programs and identify national opportunities as far as diversity initiatives are concerned. So all of that work is going to come together, as I say, with a stapler. If you go to the next slide, thanks, we'll just talk about how that's going to, or the timelines for that. It is very, very ambitious. But it is being built on a lot of work that has happened in the National Rail Action Plan over recent years, and this is really about bringing it home during the course of this year. So to bring it home, the stakeholder engagement and consultation will continue to be incredibly important. And if you feel as though you haven't been engaged and need to be, I just encourage you to reach out, because we do need to make sure that people are staying actively involved in this particular program. So the engagement process will be incredibly important, and that's why it's featuring in the way that we structured those contracts to ensure that the engagement piece is there. And we've got some support for the NTC for actually doing that engagement across the industry. We will therefore soon be in contact with you about the engagement of those 4 new streams in the first half of 2024. And the intention is to provide an interim report back to ministers mid-year, but with the intention by having an agreed reform package around these standards, interoperability, by the end of the year. A year sounds like a long time, but it's February, so the year's almost over. We're almost near Easter. So we've really got to get a wriggle on now and make sure we're landing this. And I think there's huge opportunities now to actually deliver this reform package. So with that, I could see that there were a few questions coming up in the chat, Damien. It might be best now just that if I can just ask you and to help me with what those questions were, and be very happy to answer any questions or have a conversation about what we're trying to achieve here. Thanks, everyone.
Certainly. No, thank you, Carolyn. It's a fantastic presentation. Thank you. And you're pretty passionate about this, aren't you?
Oh.
These reform opportunities, you know, rail can and has been slow to reform. So when these opportunities come up, we've just got to seize them and, yeah.
I think yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And why I am quite passionate about it at the moment is I can see a fantastic opportunity here, because it's almost like the stars are aligning between a great deal of understanding. Ministers get this more now than I've ever seen a group of ministers get the rail industry. Ministers move on quite regularly through our national federal system, and I think we've really got to strike while the iron's hot to, you know, get this onto the right road. Yeah, so I am very keen on it.
That's a good segue into the first question. We know that government commitments can only be guaranteed as far as the next election. Is there wider cross-party support to keep this great initiative going if there are changes to state and federal governments in the future?
I think the answer to that is yes, but there's always a danger, because as we've now got this better engagement of ministers at the state, territory and Commonwealth level, I think we're getting a greater understanding amongst the bureaucracies and the policy makers as well, who are providing that policy advice to whatever minister or government is on the day. So I think it's actually generated a great deal of understanding of what is the mischief we're trying to cure and what's the opportunity we're going to get here. And I think the opportunity just at the moment, with a great deal of commitment to climate change action and the environment, I think there's also a recognition about the importance of the shift in transport task from road to rail, both of which will grow. It's not as though there's going to be a loss of jobs on the roadside, but we'll need to have a modal shift to rail, particularly in the freight task, if we're going to really achieve net zero commitments. And I think that is gaining more cross-party support and energy. So yeah, I think there can be, but I do think the danger is we miss the opportunity while we do have a cohort of ministers and a national cabinet who see this as a high priority.
Okay. I'm not surprised with this question coming up. With ATMS and ETCS well advanced in development, have we missed the boat on train control interoperability? How are we going to address this?
So look, I think the answer to that is, fortunately, no, I don't think we have missed the boat. I think we've got a huge challenge, and I know I don't want to speak on behalf of ARTC. I know that they're working very, very hard at the moment to seriously review their rollout of their train control system, and we haven't got to the stage yet where they have absolutely locked in their system, absolutely locked in the Eastern Seaboard's locked in theirs, and rolling stock operators are already procuring kit to meet those particular requirements. I think there's a lot of costs that have already gone into these different systems. I think it would have been great if we were taking a more structured approach to interoperability 10 or 15 years ago, but we are where we are. And fortunately, over the last few years, with this recognition of the need to not go down the digital break of gauge, I think we are getting real commitment now from all of the players to identify solutions. They may end up being more costly than they would have been if we'd done that 15 years ago. I do think, you know, anybody who does safety and design or any of those safety, engineering principles will know that it's a lot cheaper to do these things if you do them early in the design phase. And we didn't have, and at different times over the last 15 or 20 years, I've seen individuals try to actually work well to get that done in a sensible way, but with nothing to actually lock it in, no market mechanism and no regulatory mechanism. That has sort of ebbed and flowed over the years. And I think what we need now is a commitment to a future model where there is enough lock-in to require that to be happening into the future. And that's what we need to do now. So I guess the short answer is never too late. It could have been really, really costly to rectify. Hopefully it won't be as costly as it would have been if we'd not started on this path.
I think it's another good segue to this question. Hi, Carolyn. Can you talk about any risks from short-term incentives for projects, operators, state funders that might not align with the national strategy? How can we ensure national interoperability is baked in at a high level for budgeting and program on future works at a local level? How will we keep decision makers accountable? You did sort of touch on potential for incentives, so I guess that maybe was prompted by that comment.
That is the $1 million question. That is exactly the question, which is the policy challenge that we're being faced about. How do we do that? My personal view, we've got a market failure. Often with these issues, things get resolved through the market. The market has resolved the fact that Android and Apple phones talk to each other, because if they didn't, nobody would be buying the things. And so the market finds these. You can take your e-toll tag in your car and now take it around the country and go through any motor tollway operated by different companies around the country, and it will still go to your bill and you'll be recognised around the country. So often these solutions are driven by market solutions, and it's clear that that's not been driving the right solutions in rail. So where you've got a market failure, you've got to find out other mechanisms for actually addressing that market failure. They could be regulatory, mandating people do things, and in that path you go down. It could be very prescriptive and get to the dead hand of government now determining what the technology will be, and then having no flexibility and innovation in the future. So that's exactly what we've got to try and find, the right governance arrangements and the right mechanisms to ensure that that people at the very local level, as they're focusing on their own problems and their own needs, are required to have a view to the impact on the interoperable network. So as an example, one of the key things that ministers have already agreed to in principle is that the Rail Safety National Law should be amended to have the elements of a safety management system include an interoperability management plan. As many people around the call would know, 30 elements of a current safety management system. You've got to look at, an emergency management plan, a risk management plan, procurement, all those different things. We're having an explicit requirement to have an interoperability plan, which basically says, if I am on that interoperable network, I have a requirement to have a plan about how I'm going to engage with and interact with my fellow rail infrastructure managers across that network. That is one thing we can do, but in my view won't be sufficient, which is why ministers have also agreed we're going to have to mandate some standards that actually lock that in, so a regulatory agency can actually enforce people to meet those standards to achieve the interoperable outcome. And there may be other ideas as we go through this process this year of really locking in what that governance arrangement should be. We've already started. If anybody who was at the technology framework last year, I did put up a straw man about what that might look like. Natalie Pelham, as the new head of the Office of the Rail Safety National Regulator, quickly came in with a 10-point plan, which she's now drafting up to try and see how that might work. And this is what we need to go out to consultation now to see how to drive that and get the either through compliance incentives. I'm incentivised because I know I need to comply with a requirement, or even better, through structuring things so there's actually a positive incentive for people to be rewarded for moving to an interoperable system.
Okay. Next one's about rolling stock approvals. Is any action planned to bring the allowable track geometry irregularities for given speeds into alignment between rail infrastructure managers across Australia to foster safe interoperability of rolling stock in terms of dynamic behaviour through simulation testing in accordance with AS 7509?
Probably getting into things above my pay grade, Damien, in terms of the technical side of that. But in principle, the work that 9 Squared is doing is looking at how do we actually ensure that there's a process by which you have potential mutual recognition of another RIMS approvals process where you do have like-for-like infrastructure standards. And I think this is where this question is going to. But where they are different, you can't just automatically accept a type approval from another operator if your operating environment, your you know, the sort of things that you just mentioned there, are different to the other ones. So that's actually what we've got to try and do, is how do you bring the common standards and technologies into one place so that a single approval would be sufficient to meet any operator's needs in terms of demonstrating that rolling stock will be safe and operable on that network. But how do you also then identify what are the things that are different in each of the networks that would require an additional but marginal additional set of approvals? So if I can take that one offline, Damien, and get my smarter people in the NTC, supported by some of these contractors that we've now got in with those technical skills, we could, like we do sometimes after these podcasts, come up with a response that we can post that provides a little bit more detail on the technical side of that.
And I think on that one in particular, you know, RISSB's been reflecting on its role in this space. We need to be careful we don't end up with the lowest common denominator outcome. You know, this is an opportunity not just to streamline and also not gold plate, but make sure that we're not just institutionalizing the lowest common denominator. It's taking the opportunity to actually both streamline the approvals and introduce some best practice, or at least have a pathway to best and better practice.
Yeah, no, the point you raised, Damon, I think is really a good one, because the challenge is some rail infrastructure operators would argue that if they have the capability and capacity to put a higher standard requirement on a bit of rolling stock and want to do that, they would argue that that's their obligation under the Rail Safety National Law to meet their SAFARP argument in terms of anything more they can reasonably do to improve the safety of their operations. But if that means that we now have suboptimal investment opportunities across the country, so a freight operator now won't invest in a new train that actually has demonstrably safer kit and kit that's better for the environment, but it's just too hard to try and get that approved across all of the networks, then we end up with a suboptimal outcome. So this is why we've got to be thinking as a network as a whole and as an industry as a whole to say, how can we make sure that these different standards adopted by different infrastructure managers are actually improving the safety and the productivity of the whole network, not actually standing in its way. And I personally believe there are many at the moment that it's just being thwarted by this sense that it's my network, I'm accountable for it, and this is all true. So I think we also need some stuff in the Rail Safety National Law that sort of belts and braces around the requirement that is already there in the law about shared responsibility for shared risk. And there is an obligation under the law for rail transport operators to work together and collaborate to address shared risk. And I think that we need something under that this is probably where we can hook the issues around interoperability on a national network, because if there's anything that talks about shared risk, it's the infrastructure managers all operating the single national network. They're sharing the risk. When a train comes into my network, I've got a shared risk with both the above rail operator, but also what my next door neighbour has done in terms of that. So working together on that to get an optimal outcome from both productivity and safety is, I think, what we're trying to achieve here. And people will talk about, oh, we're moving to lowest common denominator. I've always found in national reform that everyone loves it as long as everyone agrees to their way of doing things. And we've got to get beyond that to make this reform work.
Okay, and we'll make this the last question. And as I've said in the opening, you know, you are leading with government on those 4 or 5 big ticket issues. And my view, for what it's worth, industry should take this opportunity with the momentum that's created there to be dealing with other stuff that's within its remit. Otherwise, you might find government, having completed those 4 or 5 things, might be a little way off, will start doing other stuff. So this question, although historically the rail industry has focused on heavy rail, how will this program align with the enormous growth in light rail and in fact heavy passenger rail as well, which really isn't picked up in this work, which is now operational in most of the eastern states and growing?
So one thing I would like to say in terms of heavy rail is it does pick up heavy rail passenger stuff. This is equally about the Garn going from Darwin to Adelaide and the Indian Pacific coming across from Perth into Sydney, and for the Victorian, as Ben Farland mentioned, for his rolling stock acquisition, he needs to know and understand how his passenger trains are going to operate through those multiple networks as well. So it is absolutely passenger trains on the heavy rail network. The point about other railway systems like light railway systems, we haven't really turned our attention to, because, to be honest, it is a much lesser order of priority, because I don't want to think like this, because back in the day, a lot of colonies didn't think our railways would join up either. But at the moment, light rail systems don't tend to line up nationally. There has been debates about them lining up, though, within jurisdictions, debates in Sydney about the different light rail standards that are being developed, and that's a whole other level of issue. It hasn't really been incorporated in this reform process, but it's a good question, and one that we should keep our mind's eye to as we go through this process.
Yeah, and look, I would encourage people, as I say, government are grabbing hold of some big fundamental reform issues. Let's take the opportunity to ride on the coattails. So, yep, light rail might not be intrinsically in your program, but I'm expecting industry to have a much greater emphasis and focus on interoperability, which doesn't just need to be operational interoperability. It's, of course, like rolling stock and the productivity advantages of taking that approach as well. Look,
yeah,
Carolyn,
that interoperability actually then allows for harmonised rule books and all the things that flow from that as well, of course, Damon. Yeah,
that's it. Look, Carolyn, thank you so much for your time. You've been very generous. I think certainly the interest was reflected in the numbers, and I don't know that too many have pulled out over the last 3/4 of 50 minutes or so. So thank you so much. It is a subject that needs and is getting the attention, and I think we all look forward to continuing to contribute and help the NTC and others.
Yeah, thanks, Damon. I really appreciate the support of RISSB, the ARA, and all the industry players who are really coming in to work together on getting this reform done. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And just a message for the next webinar, Monday, the 26th of February, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. I assume that's Eastern time. Likely invites have gone out. Australian Rail Innovation, testing autonomous wagons on the ARC network. So this will be a joint presentation between Parallel Systems and ARC Infrastructure. So we look forward to that one. Thank you everyone for your time today, and have a safe day. Thanks.